For the second time in the history of Twin Peaks conversations, we'll be focusing at least as much, if not more, on a non Peaks feature film. This time the subject will be a little closer to home than it was with Vera Drew and The People's Joker a few months ago, since we'll be discussing a book on Lost Highway, David Lynch's follow up to Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. Also, for the second time, I'm inviting a previous guest back. As with John Thorne, Scott Ryan has now written a new book worth discussing in its own right. I last spoke to him in December 2021 in anticipation of his book on Fire Walk with Me. Lost Highway, The Fist of Love stands in fascinating contrast with Scott's work on Fire Walk with Me, Your Laura Disappeared. It's much heavier on interviews with cast and crew from the film, from this particular film, and it deals with a subject that Scott is coming to as a relatively new viewer, rather than somebody who's been, watching the work for decades, as was the case with Fire Walk with Me. This, plus Scott's always engaging personality, makes for a lively discussion that I think you'll all enjoy. The second part, which detours into Twin Peaks and other Lynch subjects alongside Lost Highway, is available as always to the $5 a month tier on patreon.com/lostinthemovies. Before the conversation begins, a very brief update on my own work. This episode was originally intended for May, but was delayed until mid-June, as with the entry intended for April. As such, it's appearing just a week after the last episode, which was an in-depth exchange with Twin Peaks hosts Matt and Ashley, and you'll definitely want to check that one out if you haven't already. Together, these officially conclude the regular monthly, or at least intended to be monthly, Twin Peaks conversation series that began in September 2021. However, you can expect at least one, hopefully 2, 3, or more, bonus episodes over the summer and fall. One with another repeat guest, this time a third appearance, which of course gives the game away as to who I'm talking about, has already been partially recorded. I'm also releasing the finale of my Twin Peaks Cinema Public podcast this week, a look at Baraboo, the directorial debut of Lynch's collaborator and partner Mary Sweeney. This wraps 3 months of the Long Road Home season, which also included The Straight Story and, appropriately enough for this conversation, Lost Highway, which I compared to Twin Peaks back in April. The episode will be linked below.
Just wanted to share a brief announcement. Apologies for both the sound of my voice, which has deteriorated lately, and also for the sound quality, as I don't have my microphone with me. But just wanted to make sure you knew that Scott is screening Lost Highway tomorrow at the Lumiere Cinema at the Music Hall in Beverly Hills, with a Q&A guided by George Griffith, the actor from Twin Peaks, and people from the cast and crew of Lost Highway present there, so you definitely want to check it out on the big screen in that full presentation. So make your way to that, 7:30 p.m. Saturday, June 24th. Okay, on with the show, where I promise my voice is better and the sound quality is better than this.
With that, let's launch this last regular episode of Twin Peaks Conversations. You're here again on the show because you wrote a new book. I interviewed you in late 2021 to talk about your Fire Walking book. And I believe you'd already I think you'd already started or were conceiving of the Lost Highway book at that point. Is that correct? Had you already started writing it in late 2021?
I have no idea.
Fair enough. But you did get it out for the 25th anniversary last year, 2022. So you've made some great appearances on like Twin Peaks Unwrapped and other podcasts. I'm going to link that episode below. So we'll try not to cover too much of the same.
Those boys get enough. Those boys get enough.
They
don't need another link.
I loved your thanks at the end too, that they talk about in that podcast with Ben and Brian. They celebrated their was 8th anniversary today. So happy podversary or whatever to them. Which, by the way, before we get dive deep into the Lost Highway book, I just wanted to say you put out an episode late last year saying sort of farewell to the Red Room podcast. The platform's going to close, but it's still there, right? It's like Wile E. Coyote kind of hanging over the cliff and not looking down.
I don't understand how it's still out there. I mean, seriously, yeah. I don't understand, because someone else told me, like, no, they're there. So we house them for all, I don't know how many years we did that podcast, 12 years or something stupid. We at Hipcast. So Hipcast sent us a thing. They were like, look, your podcast is going to cease to exist on December 31st. We're out of business. Get your files or they're gone. And it's gone. I can't upload a new one. There's nothing I can do to create it, but and yet it appears to still be out on iTunes. So how is that possible? We can't do any more. Now, whether they're still out there, I don't know.
Get
But
them while they're hot, folks. Check
yeah, I
them
mean,
out.
I don't know. I mean, where are they linking to? So I don't know if they're there, and if they're there, I don't know how long they're going to be there.
So, as I said on the Twin Peaks Unwrapped episode, you kind of dive deep into history, but if you can and I think you discussed it even on the previous episode a little bit where we talked about Firewalk with Me, but just for new listeners or people who've forgotten, give them a quick overview, if you could, of what led you to this book, because it's pretty unique and pretty heavily in contrast with how you came to the Firewalk with Me book.
Yeah, I mean, if there's nothing I wanted to do less than follow up my Firewalk with Me book with any book on David Lynch. It's really not been my style, and the Firewalk with Me book was really my first David Lynch book I ever did myself. I like to do different things with each project that I work on. So when I finished Firewalk with Me, I was really focusing on this 90s book. That's where my brain was going. But Glenn Gordon Caron created Moonlighting, and I did a book on moonlighting, and he and I have crazily become friends. And he did a show called Medium, which starred Patricia Arquette. And when Moonlighting came out and he was very pleased with the book, I felt like I had one ask in me. And I said, hey, would you connect me with Patricia Arquette? I've always wanted to interview her. And he did. And Patricia agreed to an interview, and they gave me a half hour. And you had to talk to her about Lost Highway because, my goodness, and there's so many things I could have talked to her about. But once I had this Lost Highway interview, I was like, well, I'm gonna try Peter Deming, who said yes, and Sabrina, who said yes, and then Balthazar said yes, and Natasha Gregson said yes, and then I even got Deepak Nair, who I couldn't get for my Firewalk with Me book, but then they were like yes, and I had all these interviews, and so the Lost Highway book literally fell in my lap. There was not. It wasn't like a deep burning desire for me to write this book. It's just I got the interviews, and the interviews were too good. They deserved a book.
Yeah, I think it seems like the Firewalk with Me book was 30 years in the making, and this one was about 6 weeks, which isn't a criticism. Like
No, it
I love it,
literally was
but
6 weeks.
it's a cool contrast because when you read the Firewalk with Me book, you're getting like a life experience with that, basically like a guided tour by somebody who has lived with that film for so long. And with Lost Highway, it's almost like we're discovering it alongside you because you didn't watch it for the first time. It was the last Lynch film you saw. You saw it in 2017 for the first time, and are finding out all these new things about it now. So it's a fascinating contrast between the two. And I think between most of the books that you've written, because most of them are on things that have long been sort of favorite subjects of yours.
Yeah, they're like
right? Yeah.
lifelong passions of mine. And my overall passion in life is getting to interview people. I always wanted to be David Letterman, but that job was taken. So what are you going to do? And so, you know, I know that if I'm given the opportunity to interview someone, it's going to go well, and we're going to get to the bottom of what we need to get to. So that's there. But as far as a passion for Lost Highway, and that was the other funny thing, when I watched Lost Highway in Dallas, sitting right next to George Griffith, watching it in 35 millimeter in a pretty much sold out room, knowing that when it was over, George was going to interview me about the book and the movie, I actually was like, who the hell am I to write a book about Lost Highway? Like when I was watching it there, I was like, I don't know anything about this movie. I can't talk about this. This is one hell of a movie. Like in the book, I'm really secure with my thoughts, and I'm like, you've got to be passionate when you're writing, and you've got to write in a strong voice and let that narrator come through. But there was just that moment like, I don't know anything about Lost Highway. I mean, it's a hell of a movie.
Well, this book is fascinating too because it's very much you do have some chapters sprinkled throughout. Like you have an early chapter where you talk about your sort of reading of the film and go through the plot and the scenes that were cut from it, and you have some stuff at the end, kind of meditating on Jack Nance and some other stuff about the film, and you have the section in the middle with the soundtrack, which is great, sort of a companion to your Firewalk With Me piece. But putting that aside, like probably 75-80% of the book, if not more, is interviews.
Right.
So Firewalk With Me was sort of a mix of many different approaches. What was it with this one that made you decide to keep, because I know you've written oral history format before where you split up the quotes and kind of like with Moonlighting, I think you did that. What was
Right.
it with this one that made you, because I think it works really well, but what was your decision process of, I'm going to leave these interviews like intact, basically, like it's going to be a chapter talking to this person, a chapter talking to that one, versus like mixing them all up in a sort of chronology or something?
Yeah, I mean, I did that with the Letterman book, and then that's what I did with the Moonlighting book. But when
Mm.
I finished the Moonlighting book, I was like, I'm never doing an oral history again. They are so hard. And when it's done, everybody feels like, oh, every interview just rolled into the next one and how easily it told the story. But it's horrible. That's not how it works. And you have to put together this puzzle that is, you don't have the box top and you have no idea what the picture is, and it's just too much work. And the other thing is, when I did the Letterman book, I had Barbara Gaines, who was Dave's executive producer, who would take my call every day. So when I needed something to get from A to C,
Mhm.
she would give me B. In Moonlighting, I had Jay Daniels, who was the executive producer. Well, with Lost Highway, I didn't have anyone. Like the interviews I got one shot and then they were gone. And I even sent Patricia a couple follow-up questions because, like I said, I started with her. And when I interviewed her, I hadn't even watched the movie again. Like I was just going from what I knew, but I hadn't studied it yet. And then afterwards, I sent her follow-ups, but she didn't send me answers. Like you're not going to get Patricia Arquette to keep answering your questions. I mean, she's maybe the busiest actress in Hollywood. So I couldn't do an oral history because I didn't have that person that could really plug it in. I mean, that's probably a boring answer, but that's like the nuts and bolts of how you create art. And you got to go with what you got.
That makes total sense, but I also felt like it worked aesthetically for the film because first of all, like it's not um I feel like something like a Letterman or book or like a Moonlight, especially a Moonlighting, where you're covering a show over many seasons, like what Brad did with Twin with Reflections, Oral History of
Mm-hmm.
Twin Peaks. There's a kind of a long, almost snake-like flow to it, where you want the voices coming in and out. Lost Highway is a little more concentrated. It's like one film production, and I also feel like because the film itself, even for like a Lynch film, you can't call it linear exactly, but
Right.
it's like more focused. Like it doesn't have an ensemble like Mulholland Drive or even like Wild at Heart kind of does. It's like you're with Fred, then you're with Pete, and you kind of follow them along, but you're like with like one person at a time, but you're like sort of switching lenses. And so that aspect of it worked really well for me, where it's like now you're going to sit with the photography and we're going to go through everything. We're going to talk about the oh, now I'm forgetting what was the great term in there, the
Oh,
lens.
lens whacking.
Lens whacking, right? So you're going through all these technical things, these great stories with like Gary Busey getting all upset about it and stuff, but like then you're over to something else, maybe like the sort of nuts and bolts of like, you know, Deepak Nair like running a set, and then you're switching over to like somebody, to an actor, and they're talking about their specific role, and they're like, so it actually works, I think, really well for this film in a way. I wouldn't be complaining if this was an oral history. I'm sure I would have enjoyed it, but I thought giving sort of isolating each element and giving it its space worked really
Well, and
nicely.
the other thing is when you have Deepak, you want to hear about On the Air and Fire Walk with Me and his Twin Peaks story. And
Hmm.
when you have Peter Deming, like I had to ask him about part three because I love part three of Twin Peaks. And that was the other part. Like there were other things to discuss. And like when Debbie Zoller, like I love her interviews so much. She was the makeup person on Lost Highway and The Return. But her talking about Star Trek to me is so fascinating. And you could never put that in the oral history because someone
Right,
else
where
wasn't
would
going to
that
talk
go?
about Star Trek. You know what I mean? And so in a lot of ways, the project like speaks to what it needs to become.
Yeah.
And I also knew that Lost Highway was going to be a hard sell, and it has been. It hasn't sold nearly as well as the Fire Walk with Me book. Like the Fire Walk with Me book just, I only have one case left and then they're gone forever. Like that's it.
Yeah.
And because it's Fire Walk with Me and it's Twin Peaks. With Lost Highway, I knew I had to widen that conversation. And there is a lot of conversation about who David Lynch is as an artist. Now, it doesn't help sell the book because people who don't like Lost Highway are like, screw it, I don't care. That movie's stupid. I don't want to hear anything. But there's so much. I think there's more information about David Lynch. Here's a quote for you. Let's see if this makes people angry. There's more information about David Lynch, the person, in my Lost Highway book than there is in Room to Dream. Boom. Take that. Because to me, Room to Dream, while being an important book, is a TV commercial for David Lynch. I just don't believe it to be factual. But in my book, you are getting stories from people who really worked with him. They're not like platitudes of what a genius David is. You're getting the nuts and bolts of a day with David Lynch. I think Deepak tells the story about Lynch saying, I'll be there in 2 minutes or whatever. But
Yeah.
the script will be there in 5 minutes, and then you read it for 19 minutes, call me that story. But it doesn't matter. I feel like I was provocative enough by saying Room to Dream. So you could just say, are you kidding me? Room to Dream? That's the greatest book ever. And then I'll tell you why it's a
Well,
horrible book.
one thing I would say in response to the Room to Dream question, I guess, is it's interesting to me that Greg Olson had the book Beautiful Dark that came out about 10 years earlier. And he had a lot of cooperation from Lynch while he was writing it, but it's not like I don't think it's like an authorized biography or anything like that. And that one, in some way, that goes very in depth in a way that only like a not like even with the access, like a non-authorized biography or like a non-official, let's say, biography would. So yeah, I really enjoyed Room to Dream. It had great stories in it. I loved the novelty of the contrast between the chapters that like Lynch himself narrated and then the ones that were like Christine McKenna gathered insights from others. But I feel like the fact that it's filtered through David Lynch officially, it is going to it's it's not necessarily going to give you the insight that an external observer who is not like asking Lynch for permission basically would give you, if that
Yeah,
makes
and I mean,
sense.
and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is my trouble with getting interviews. So to interview someone like Deepak Nair, who doesn't care if he works with David Lynch again, not that he wouldn't work with David Lynch, but he doesn't need to work with David Lynch to eat.
Mm-hmm.
He just tells stories. He's telling you what it was like to be on the set of Fire Walk with Me and Lost Highway. Now, you could argue the point that all memory is, we all like to remember things our own way. And so it's not that everything everyone tells me is true. But if you're trying to get an interview from a season 3 or the return cast member, a new return cast member. Oh my God, they're so afraid of telling you anything that they tell you nothing. And to me, you were just really getting great stories. Like I felt like there weren't any blockers. And in Room to Dream, a lot of it is going through that filter, like, oh, we can't tell that, we can't show that. Oh, good. Then what's the point of the book? What like, then you're just a DVD bonus feature that was put together by the studio.
Well, it's funny you're talking about Deepak. Another reason that you couldn't have done an oral history is because it would be like sentence, several paragraphs by Deepak sentence. Like it wouldn't have worked.
No, I know. I mean, I never said less in an interview than I did with Deepak. I mean, I realized about 10 minutes into the interview, oh, he actually doesn't need me. I really don't have any point here. I'm just going to listen to these stories and laugh and be a good audience. And then that's my job that day. My job was to be a really good audience for Deepak and just let him talk. Because when I asked him a question, he didn't answer it. He told me a story he wanted to tell me. And that was better anyway.
I'm trying to remember. So there was something I may not be able to pull it out. There was something before I thought of the Deepak thing. There was something about you were describing. This is the problem with the interruptions. There was you were talking about the reason for not doing it. Well, if I'll come back to that if I think of it. But as far as some of the other interviews in the book go, one of the things, and this is not just about the book, but also just even some of the interviews you've given before about it. You're very good at like sort of issuing superlatives to each interview that is like totally true, but like non-competing. Like you're not like this one was the best one, and this one you're like this one was the one where like they felt like my best friend. Like this was the one that was like my favorite interview because it was this, and it's true.
Mhm.
It's like each one kind of has this special quality to it. I feel like so. I guess if you could give some of the listeners now a little sense of that, of like what you got from, you don't have to go through all of them, but like four or five that really stuck out for like different reasons to you, and why that was.
Well, I'll start with the worst one. Peter Deming and I did not bond. And that is rough for a comedian because at the end, I'm a comedian at heart. I just have never made money at it. And this was my problem with introducing the movies in Dallas, is I would stay up there until I got a laugh. And I was doing the David Lynch shorts, and there was only like 12 people in the theater. It really was not. And I couldn't get a laugh. Nobody was laughing. And I mean, I almost told them, like, look, people, we're going to be a long day because I'm not getting off the stage until I get one. I don't remember how I got one. It was probably cheap, but I got one and I was out. But Peter Deming was so interesting. I mean, but I don't know that he was ready for my nonsense. He's very technical
Yeah,
in the
I got
best
that
way.
sense. Yeah, it came
You
through
know,
in the interview. It was, and I like it too because it does create an interesting contrast with other ones who you have a lot of banter going with and a lot of
yeah, because
back and
sometimes I'm
forth.
just
Like
a
it's a little color
jackass
in there.
and I shouldn't be like, I mean, Natasha Gregson Wagner. I mean, me and her should be best friends. And the thing that was super cool is she came to Dallas and I gave her a book. And then she read it on the plane ride home. And when she got home, she texted me and she said, "Hey, BFF." And I thought that was cute because I said in my special thanks that I think we should be best friends, but we just should be. We're about the same age, we have the same sensibilities, and I want to be best friends with her. And she is coming to my LA event on June 24th. And so I've got one more chance to like seal that deal and be best friends with her. To me, someone like Scott Rustler, that guy knows everything. I mean, he is the camera puller, I think is what he likes to be called, but basically he focuses things on the camera. And he's just done everything. He worked on Wild at Heart, and then you just go through. When someone is right there at the camera, it's so interesting that everybody wants to like interview Kyle. Like, oh, if we get Kyle MacLachlan, can we get Sherilyn Fenn in here? And yeah, they have good stories, but not like the cameraman. Like the cameraman was there for everything. That's where you really find things out. To me, Debbie Zoller is so inspiring. Like her story moved me, and I am not letting her go. I want her to write a book for my company, and she keeps saying, nobody wants to read about makeup. And I'm like, yes, they do. I mean, you are in that chair with them and the people she's worked with and her stories, and she's so smart, and I love smart women. Um, so I'm never giving Debbie Zoller up until she says yes. And then Deepak is where you get the true you can't read that interview and not walk away with what it's like to spend time with David Lynch. He loved David Lynch, but he's not afraid of David Lynch. And when you have those things, you get a sense of who he is. Sabrina Sutherland to me is the most professional person I've ever come in contact with. The thing that I like to say about Sabrina every time I get the chance is she has bought every issue of the Blue Rose, every book we've put out about David Lynch, and we would give them to her. Like, she's never asked for them for free. And, like, I don't charge the people that's in the book. You give them one because you're thanking them. They gave you their time. And Sabrina would never take something for free. Like, she understands, one, that there is no such thing as a free book because we are paying for them. But also, she understands the work that goes in and she wants to support that. And to me, man, I will be a fan of Sabrina Sutherland's for life.
It's funny, in the previous conversation we did, you had a term which made me chuckle, which was Sabrina-fied, where you're
Yeah.
talking about
I
the
almost used it
actors.
again, and I didn't.
Well, you're talking about the actors and crew members on The Return in particular who are a little cautious, sort of like what we're
Right.
talking about with the Room to Dream, where it's like you kind of got to toe a certain line of how you talk about it. Certainly don't want to give too much away. You don't want to say too much about what happened. But Sabrina herself, in the interview you get for this book, is not Sabrina-fied, which
Well,
I thought was
she's
hilarious.
never
Like, she's
been.
very unguarded and talks about her sort of difficulty in having a little bit of, like, not exactly a naysayer role to play, but like her job was to come and sort of caution Lynch, and she could tell that he didn't like it, and she would sort of sit in the back, and then she talks about how we brought her closer and closer and finally pulled her chair forward, like, you can sit next to me now, you don't make me as nervous as you did when you were like a production manager or whatever she was at that point. So it's funny how she herself is actually very um open in this interview about her history with Lynch in a fascinating way, I thought.
I agree. I mean, I thought that section to me had never been told before, and I felt honored that she felt comfortable with me to share.
So one of the last interviews in the book that is probably, I guess, you kind of open and close with what you've made a great case for why these crew members are so, their insight is so valuable in terms of like marquee, who people are going to open up the book and be like, oh, did they? I think you open with Patricia Arquette and you close or come near to closing with Balthazar Getty.
Right.
And
The plan was to end with Bill Pullman,
right,
and
yeah.
he kept saying yes. I mean, maybe 12 times they said yes. And I just had to pull the trigger. Eventually, I said, look, it's this week or you're out. And they never responded to that
Yeah.
email. And so I didn't get Bill Pullman. But I mean, in some ways, Balthazar is almost more the star of the movie, at least in time wise. So yeah.
That's what's so interesting to me about not just the interview, but the way you set it up in the introduction, and the way you've talked about it since is so much of the movie because Fred opens and closes it, and because given that fact, we're pretty much given to understand, I think, that he is it's filtered through his consciousness. Everything we see, even the Pete stuff. Pete is like a fragment of him or something like that. And when you talk to Balthazar Getty and the fact that you only talk to him in the book, and that he's totally focused on his character, talks about how like Pete was born in jail, basically, like born in that cell in the moment of transformation, as far as his own mind goes. Like that is so interesting to think of Lost Highway as Pete's story, rather than Fred's in a way.
Yeah, and I never had that thought until I was in the middle of interviewing him. Like it dropped into my head. And that was the last interview I did for the book. The whole book was done. I was just waiting for Balthazar. So I couldn't even really go back and let that color the book in any way, which is kind of good because you're at that point of the book and then there's a new idea
Yeah.
that comes in, which is really good for the book. But he was really open, and also in Dallas I got to have like this amazing half-hour conversation with him at the bar at the theater. He couldn't be a nicer guy, and just loved it and loved the experience, and he's really a good guy.
Well, another it's funny you say, it didn't color the earlier parts of the book, because there is one part where you talk about the scene where he's in the yard and it's like something out of Blue Velvet, and it feels like the movie's like beginning there. And as I was reading that passage, it planted the idea in my head of like, what if there was like a fan film, like a fan edit, not a fan film, but like a fan
Mhm.
edit that just told and it like started the Pete story, maybe not even in prison, but like him in the yard with the credits coming up, and like, who is this guy? And you're following, and then you get the shock of him turning into Fred later. So it's almost like reversed. And then in the chapter on Balthazar Getty, you say that so it's like somehow you planted that seed anyways in my head of like, what if you actually
Right.
explicitly say in
Yeah,
the
I had
interview.
already written
That's
that.
funny.
Um, they all I had already written the that part, the music chapter
Mm-hmm.
there, because I did
That's
feel
where
that
it is.
that
Yeah.
that yeah, it's in the music chapter because I do feel that that is the opening credits for that part. But
Mm-hmm.
even when I wrote that, I wasn't thinking that you wouldn't watch the Fred part.
Right.
So that thought hadn't come to me yet, but it does feel like Lynch is like, oh, this is the opening to Blue Velvet, and it's very colorful, like Blue Velvet is.
And that's the part, I think, when I first watched Lost Highway, where I really fell in love with the movie. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that, because that mystery man scene is so
Mm.
so good at the party. Like that was the hook for me. But where I really fall under the spell is like, you're in the Pete world, and it just kind of, the movie, like it's had this tight grip throughout. It's been this like hard boiled kind of intense fever dream noir, and it kind of just relaxes all of a sudden. You get those shots the kind of shots you have, this is why I call them the Sweeney years, because they're only in, for the most part, you get hints of them in Wild at Heart and Inland Empire, but they're mostly just in the movies that she edited, where it's like these long dissolves, like you're surveying over the whole valley with the kind of low hanging clouds, and you have like a shot of Balthazar Getty's face, and it's like this cool nighttime shot of the mechanic shop, and the sort of warmth of the light and the coolness of the night around it. And there's just such an atmosphere to it, and you're totally immersed in it. Like you almost forget that that first part of the film happened, And I love that about Lost Highway. Like I really do feel like it saturates you in a mood in just a really cool way. And the
I
music
agree.
certainly contributes to that, which you write about very evocatively in that chapter.
Well, and that was my favorite thing to write in the whole Lost Highway book, because everything I wrote in that chapter was new to me. Like I had never had that thought before. I'd never done any kind of study where, like, when I wrote the music chapter in Fire Walk with Me, I mean, I'm not trying to be cocky, but like that was so boring to me. Like everything I wrote about Fire Walk with Me, I've thought about for 30 straight years. It was like I told someone my social security number and they were like, fascinating. Tell me your
It
social
was. I mean, you
security
put it
number
over very well.
again. And it's so easy to me. Like
Yeah.
I know that. I mean, if there's one thing I know in this world, it's the music of Twin Peaks. Like I don't, I mean, again, about my superlatives, but if there's someone out there that's listened to Twin Peaks music more than me over the last 32 years, I want to meet them and I want some proof. I mean, there's hardly a day that I don't listen to Angelo. And hasn't been for years. But Lost Highway, not that way. I really had to do research. Like I had to go out to the Smashing Pumpkins website and really do research to say, okay, where did these songs come from? And then I would find them in the film, and then it really opened the film up to me in a lot of ways. And I love that chapter so much.
That reminds me a little. I've been doing this character series on Twin Peaks, and I recently did an entry that is not public yet, but it is available to the patrons where I talk about the musicians of the Roadhouse. And so I guess little teaser there for because I hide the identities of the characters until they go public, but I just let one
Mm-hmm.
slip there. But it's like the whole group of them. And so for each one, I was going into their history, and it's fascinating. Like you can use the Roadhouse as a nexus, basically. And I think this is true more broadly of like the Lynch soundtracks where he has multiple artists like Lost Highway, and you can go off. And so I'm reading all about Sharon Van Etten and all these kind of travails she went through the years, that kind of brought her to that sequence in Twin Peaks. And then the stage rotates and somebody else comes on and they've got this whole crazy back history. And it's just fascinating what like a what a lens like music, I think soundtracks in particular can provide, from the work itself out to all these. It's like, shooting out into the pop culture in different directions and connecting you to different things.
This is something that I don't know about The Return that I've always wondered about, and maybe you've done this research and someone out there probably has. But have you looked at how many of those musicians that play in The Return and the Roadhouse do TM?
No, but that is a good question because I'm
I
guessing more
really
than
want
I'm
to
guessing
know.
more than 50%.
Yeah, I mean,
But I mean, not even necessarily just because he hooked up with them through TM, almost just because like he vibes with that. You know what I mean?
right.
Like
Yeah, I
those
mean,
would be the types of artists that he would
I'm just
vibe with.
curious because I don't know the answer, but
Yeah.
I've thought about it a lot. Um, and I've always wondered if someone ever did that because I don't know that it's something that I would necessarily really want to delve into. But if you had, I'd
Well,
like to
quite
know
a few
the
of the
answer.
actors have. Almost, I
Well,
feel
yeah, and
like
that right.
proportionally more than the musicians, at least that I
Well, that's
noticed.
why I wondered how much it
Yeah.
rolls over to it.
Like there were people who were like at his house, and apparently some of them it was the casting was a coincidence. They were like, "Oh, I guess I get in with him because I was in TM," and then they like mentioned to him like, "Remember that time I was at your house to meditate?" And he like stared at them like, "What?" What are you talking? Like the guy who plays the laughing cop, I think one of the Fuscos. He was like, "Oh, I guess that's why I got the part," and then like Lynch didn't even remember.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty funny, but yeah, so something I do remember, one of the things I was kind of thinking of earlier, and then couldn't remember when you were talking about how the book, has you didn't expect it to sell as well and it hasn't sold as well. Um, this to me, I think, is one of the most interesting kind of subjects that you broach in the book in terms of offering kind of a way to look at Lost Highway that I have thought somewhat about, but maybe not as much from this vantage point. And at the same time, like I can sort of see another perspective on it as well. So in my case, and I feel like it's how you look at it because you raise a ton of good points about why Lost Highway could be argued as like his most underrated work, like even compared to like or his least kind of exposed work, maybe. Does that make sense as a term? Would you use that, or how would you put it?
Um, I think I keep saying it's the Lost film because I
Lost film.
liked
Okay.
Lost and Lost,
Right.
but I mean it's just was forgotten. It was kind of ignored, I think. It's just the only one that just came and went. I
And
don't know what the right term of it is, but that's how I feel.
that's an interesting point you make. Like I said, like you make a good case for it, where it's like, well, hey, even Inland Empire has had sort of more exposure recently, like more of a revival than Lost Highway, and even Dune, like that was actually his most profitable film. You kind of go thing by thing, and it's like hard to argue with. At the same time, it's funny because my impression, I feel like, was more that it was kind of more popular, and I feel like that might be among. I mean, I think I could say I feel like a lot of Lynch film fans do like it, but again, you make some good points about how it's sort of not necessarily as discussed as some of the others. Um, but
Well, I can tell you we did an issue on Lost Highway, issue
yeah,
17, the Blue Rose, least selling issue in our history. This book, I keep a spreadsheet and, of all my customers, and I try not to bother them with emails if they already bought the book. So I'm only like marketing to the people who didn't or whatever. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. What percentage of Firewalk with Me people have Lost Highway? And I should probably look at that. And it was like, oh wow. Like, you know, very may and I just don't believe that Firewalk with Me wasn't a good enough book to make you want to get the next one. It wasn't me because they are similar, and I'm not the star of Lost Highway. You've got Patricia Arquette and Peter Deming. You know what I mean? Like, so it's the topic, and I just don't think people care about Lost Highway like they care about Twin Peaks. I mean, the percentage is like 20%, maybe. Like, it's a big drop off.
so my perception was more that it was not as big as like a Mulholland Drive or a Blue Velvet, but that in a way it sort of, I think Firewalk with Me has made a huge comeback, and certainly the fact that Twin Peaks itself came back helped with that. But for like a time like before that, it felt like Lost Highway was the film where he was starting to kind of pull himself out of obscurity again. Even though it didn't do that well, but it was clearly an antecedent to Mulholland Drive, and I would like sort of hear it discussed a lot in conjunction with that. And I almost feel like Lost Highway's strongest kind of arena is like cinephilia and like film scholarship, because this is a film, like I think Slavoj Žižek wrote like a book about it or something. There was all these sort of like essays like analyzing the film, and it's like among like a certain type of like hip cinephile. I feel like this hit a sweet spot, and I think the soundtrack helped too, where it's like that kind of connected it with the zeitgeist in a way that some of his other stuff didn't. So like I've always felt like it was a sort of a little bit of a sleeper. Like it wasn't um the big one, but it was like right on the sort of periphery of that. But then again, like I'm saying, like I almost feel like it's, do you look at it through the Fred lens or the Pete lens? It's like
Mhm.
on the other hand, it is all these other aspects are in art. I think you point out, like it's now that Inland Empire has been re-released and kind of made the rounds. It like even that film I think is more profitable than Lost Highway, right?
Right.
And
I
didn't you put
mean,
that in the beginning or
yeah,
something?
so I
Yeah.
actually thought, well, this is interesting. Inland Empire had a re-release and it went in theaters, and Lost Highway had a re-release and went in theaters, and those numbers are public. And again, Inland Empire's gross beat Lost Highway's gross. More people went to see Inland Empire and the re-release when it came out last summer than went to Lost Highway. And by the numbers, Lost Highway is Lynch's lowest grossing film. I mean, it's 3.6 million versus Mulholland Drive, which had 7.1 million. And Oscar nominations. And
Yeah.
there, why is it, and I think I know the answer, but why is it that every list puts Mulholland Drive, in the top of the best films of the new millennium, but Lost Highway, I've never even seen on a list. anyway. And I mean, I personally think it's because Lost Highway, you've got a female killer and she's pretty. And, it's got the 50s nice dum, dee da dee da dee dum, and it's all safe. Now there's some scary parts, but Lost Highway is really how men treat women. And, the blonde hot girl is actually a monster, using Patricia Arquette's words. And we don't want that. Please do not be showing us that. Just in the same way with Fire Walk with Me, like, oh, we don't want to see that women are sexually abused. Move that to the side. That's why I think they struggle, but what do I know? I just wrote 2 books on both films.
I think it's interesting that there's a couple. So like, I'm just thinking as I'm thinking about that sort of, that observation I had, that this feels like a proto, like it feels like Michael Haneke almost kind of remade it with Cachet in a way where he has somebody receiving videotapes that are like spying on him and stuff like that. So it's like, it feels like this antecedent to these major like 2000s or 2010s kind of art films. And I think in that sense, it's almost like a filmmaker's film in a way, where I feel like it's sort of like the Velvet Underground of like David Lynch's films in a way, where it's like, okay, maybe it's not as big as some of the others, but like a lot of the people who are like heavily into film, either making it or talking about it, maybe bump it up a little in their own. Like I'd be interested to look at the recent Sight and Sound list, where actually some Lynch stuff kind of hopped up the charts. Like I think Mulholland Drive made the top 10 for the first time, if I'm not mistaken. And I would be interested to take another look and see where Lost Highway is on that, because I have a suspicion that it would be certainly among the top 5 of his films, if depending how many are on there. Like that, I would be surprised if it hadn't risen since the 2012 list, let's say. Or especially maybe the 2002 one, because they do it every 10 years. But so I get that sense. And also I feel like part of the reason I had that, I had like a more like an impression that this film was maybe more popular than it was in a way, is because like when you're in it, it feels very like it feels strong in a way that makes you feel like you're watching like a central work of the 90s, even though it like came out like 1 week in January and was gone or something like that. Like you just feel, because it has so many aspects of the culture of the time, that like you're watching something that's like a huge tentpole. That like, I think Straight Story is an interesting contrast, because that was a film that was much more well received at the time. And I think got Oscar nominations for Richard Farnsworth, and there was like a kind of a buzz around it that there wasn't around Lost Highway. And Straight Story, to me, top 2 or 3. I really love that film, but I feel like that has been more forgotten now than Lost Highway has. You know what I mean? Like I think in the current day, Lost Highway is kind of bumped up a little bit, maybe.
Well, I mean, maybe between those 2 films today, but if Straight Story ends up on Disney Plus, which did they
That'll
put it
be an
on there?
interesting case. I
I
think they
mean,
did, yeah.
that's the difference where we are right now. Think about, you are an executive, and we live in a time when everyone's afraid to get canceled. You're gonna put Lost Highway with those scenes that are, I have this friend, and she hadn't seen Lost Highway in years, and she said, I'm gonna read your book, but I'm gonna watch Lost Highway before I read it. And when she watched it, and then she sent me a text and said, do you write in your book how fucking hot this movie is? And I was like, no, I skipped that part, but it is very
Yeah,
erotic, and in a good way. Like, I think
totally.
erotic is a bad word in 2023, but in the 90s, Basic Instinct and Body of Evidence and The Last Seduction, erotic thrillers were fine. We were all okay with them. And there are some good ones and there are some shitty ones. I don't know. Could any the Netflix ain't putting Lost Highway up, because you have to hold this complex idea that she's using her sexuality to get free and rob these rich men. And all anyone can see is men are doing bad things to women. Cancel them because we can't have that, complex thoughts. So I don't see Lost Highway having a comeback. I just don't.
This will be interesting to check on, I guess, in in maybe 5 years or so, and see if it's continued to sort of rise. Like, when did the Criterion just come out now?
Yeah, just came out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, you can go back on a lot of my interviews 10 years ago, and I was saying, look, Twin Peaks is never coming back. Guys, stop it.
I did
Mark
too,
my
yeah.
word. So I am great at being wrong. It's one of my specialties is being wrong. I love being wrong. It doesn't bother me. I have no problem taking a stand. I never have, and I never will.
So we're gonna go to the patron part in a moment for the listeners. But before we get to that, before we go on with that particular subject, I just, we're going to end the public part here, move to the patron part. And I want to give the listeners, before we get to that, an opportunity for, to hear from you, where to get your book, where to follow you and your other work, and, kind of what you're up to generally.
Sure. So the new website is basically Tucker DS Press. The D and the S are for David and Scott. So it's tuckerdspress.com. Always bluerosemag.com works as well, but we're trying to like filter everything through one sort of website so you can get the Fire Walk with Me book, the Lost Highway book. Both are in color. They are beautiful. They are on photo paper, and they are limited. Like I said, with Fire Walk with Me, I only have one case left. That's about 32 books. And like for realsies, they're gone forever. Now, the black and white print on demand, you can order it on Amazon and it'll spit it out. And it's still got the same interviews, but it isn't as beautiful. And that'll be the same with Lost Highway. Right now, you can only get the color version. When they're gone, I will move to print on demand so they exist. But I mean, you want the full page picture of Patricia Arquette getting out of the cab. I mean, the book is worth it just for that. I mean, come on. You can follow me at Scott Lux Story on Twitter, Blue Rose Mag on Instagram. Follow me on Facebook. You could put a chair in my front yard and follow me at my home if you'd like.
Oh, you got to laugh, so that's good.
I mean, I'm gonna work until my wife is sick of it by now, but I mean, I'm going to go until I say something ridiculous. And I can't help it.
That might actually be a reference to something the listeners haven't heard yet, depending how this is edited, but that'll give it more of a Mobius
Oh, if
script
they know
quality.
anything
So
about
yeah.
me, they know I'm going to go. If they've heard me anywhere, they know I'm going to go until I've become a jackass. I can't help it.
All
It's
right.
my
Well,
nature.
on that note, we'll jump into the next question and take it to the Patreon from there. So I want to touch on the connection that you see between Twin Peaks and Lost Highway. If any, what do you what jumps out to you, and because this is a Twin Peaks Conversations podcast technically. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't know that I connect Lost Highway to Twin Peaks. I also am not a fan of saying that Ronette and Laura are in Club Silencio. I'm not big on connecting all of those things. I think they all come from David Lynch, and I think Lost Highway is uniquely David Lynch, and certainly Barry Gifford too, who I had the pleasure of interviewing. He's not in the book, but afterwards I interviewed him and we had a great talk. And I wish he was in the book, but it just didn't work out that way. But I think if you like The Return, you would love Lost Highway. And if you're turning away from it for reasons, Firewalk with Me will always be my favorite Lynch film. But whenever I ask someone what's their favorite Lynch film, I say, you got to throw Firewalk with Me out because you have the Twin Peaks baggage. Lost Highway is my favorite Lynch film now, which is funny because I hated it in the beginning, and it was all Wild at Heart was always my favorite. But over time, I just think Lost Highway has no fat in it. There's nothing to slow it down. There's nothing that needs to be cut out. It moves. It's a good movie, and it has nothing to do with Twin Peaks.
Do you see like any explicit contrast where there's anything that's not just like disconnected, but like almost like an opposite of Twin Peaks in some way, like a yin yang type of thing? And we're going to stop there. You can hear the rest of that exchange, that interesting kind of argument and back and forth on patreon.com/lost in the movies for the $5 a month tier. And in addition, you'll be able to find the back parts of all the previous conversations and whatever will be upcoming as well as we continue this through a series of bonus episodes that'll pop up here and there. But the regular monthly appearances, which were already kind of interrupted as these episodes got delayed, those are now coming to a conclusion. So make sure that you buy this book and check out Scott's work elsewhere, subscribe to the Blue Rose magazine and all of that. And make sure you come through to Patreon to hear the back part of our conversation, which goes even more in depth into the recent festival he attended, where it was a Lynch retrospective, generational differences, 90s films. There's all kinds of topics that we discussed there.